Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Carnegie Council and to the inaugural edition of the Doorstep podcast book talks, where we and myself and my co-host Tatiana Serafin dive in a little bit deeper with interesting books that are making their way across the transom, and we're very pleased and honored for this inaugural book talk to welcome Admiral James Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman, the authors of 2034, a novel of the next World War. Between the two of them, and we're going to be posting their biographies in full in the chat, but between the two of them, when you take a Supreme Allied Commander and four-star Admiral, and former dean of the Fletcher School. You take a White House fellow and Marine veteran and award-winning author, and put the two of them together. It produces quite an interesting read, both in the realm of fiction and storytelling, but also perhaps with the ramifications of getting us to think about where we're headed, where the world is headed, and discontinuities which may be lying ahead in our near future that could really change the way in which we live and could really have an impact on the world as it evolves into the mid-21st century. Tonight, we're going to talk with the two authors. We're going to try not to reveal too many spoilers, because if you haven't read the book yet, we want you to read the book, to buy it and to read it, and not to rely on us to tell you some of the plot twists and surprise endings in the book. But we do want to get at the heart of the story that they are telling, both in terms of the geopolitics, but also, I think, dealing with the human factors at play. Because often when we talk about policy and we talk about international affairs, we make it seem as if this is just impersonal forces colliding on the international stage, and we neglect the fact that ultimately it's about people, and it's about relationships, and it's about perceptions. And so combining all those factors together produces both a great read, and also a book which I think for policymakers and those interested in policy should be reading and be thinking very seriously about the lessons and the warnings that our co-authors are providing. What we're going to ask our audience to do is we do have in the chat function, if you think of questions or comments, please put them into the chat function. The Carnegie Council staff will be monitoring the chat, and then we're going to start with the conversation with Tatiana and myself, and then we're going to broaden it out to bring all of our participants into this conversation. So if I can ask you at any point, if you have a thought, use the chat function, and it is being monitored in real time for us to see what questions and comments are coming forth. First, of course, with the book, and what thing of course, being myself up here in Newport, and since my day job is with the U.S. Naval War College, I certainly appreciate it. The many positive references to what we do here at the college, and of course, all the references to Newport itself. Which for the readers there will give you a nice, if you haven't been to Newport, this book walks you through some of our more famous sites and places, having the characters coming through. But one of the things that really struck me as I started reading this book is how it approximates something that many of our students do here in the National Security Affairs Department when they do their coursework in the National Security Affairs Department, and their final exercise. They're asked to think about, what might the future look like? We ask them to project out into the future, what's happening. And usually our students, when they produce their assessment of the future, they fall into one of two categories. Either they say, this is the future that's going to happen and that we need to prepare for, or they say, this is the future that we see could happen, but if we take certain steps now, we can avoid that future. We can avoid having the future that we have sketched out. So to start our conversation, when you wrote this and as you were writing 2034, is Is your sense that this is the way that the world is evolving, and we have to be prepared to mitigate the consequences of the world of 2034 as you see it? Or is this a warning that if we do certain things in the 2020s, we can avoid the scenario of 2034 that you paint out?
Well, Alex and Tatiana, thank you for having us on. And let me start by just framing the book and then asking Elliot to talk a little about the characters. No spoilers here. You still have to buy the book, but I think it'll answer the very good question you pose as we go along. So the book, 2034, a novel of the First World War, of the next World War, excuse me, that's a Freudian slip because it's a bit like the First World War, and that is a story of nations sleepwalking into a war. It is set in the year 2034, and it begins in the South China Sea. And this is a story that begins in confrontation between the United States and China. And speaking of the Naval War College, it's 3 Navy destroyers clipping across these disputed waters in 2034. Commodore Sarah Hunt is in command. She investigates what appears to be a Chinese ship in distress, a merchant ship, and a series of events ensue that help us move this scenario into war. Almost simultaneously, a fighter jet is forced down over Iran with a Marine pilot. Elliot will introduce him to you in a moment. And then this is followed up in Washington by a cyber attack. This is in the first 20 pages, and it is a frame of conflict between the U.S. and China. And so to answer the very excellent question you're posing, Nick, this is a novel that is not predictive, at least I hope it's not predictive, but in fact it is cautionary. This is cautionary fiction. This is a novel about what a war with China could look like, how we could stumble into it, sleepwalk into it, pick your term, how awful it would be, how difficult it would be to control the ladder of escalation as we get further into the conflict, and how it might come out. And there are some surprises, I think, along the way. And I'll close and then throw it over to Elliot by saying it's not just the US and China. The frame of the story includes characters from Russia, from Iran, and very much from India, which plays a fascinating role, in my view, in the book. So it is a tale of cautionary fiction. As I said to someone the other day, it's number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. We're hoping it stays on the fiction list. Elliot, you want to tell us a little bit about the characters?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Admiral, and Nick and Tatiana. Thanks a lot for hosting us. So as Jim mentioned, the book opens up in the South China Sea, and you're on the bridge of the flagship of Commodore Sarah Hunt, who is leading a freedom of navigation patrol. And she is a veteran Navy officer at the end of her career. She's had a very dynamic career, not only in the surface Navy, but also a stint in U.S. naval special warfare, because this is the year 2034, and that is very much already becoming a reality. When she spies a fishing trawler that is in distress and goes to investigate. Simultaneously to this, we now cut to Major Chris Wedge Mitchell. His call sign is Wedge because a wedge is the world's oldest and simplest tool, and that is very much his character. He is a 4th-generation Marine fighter pilot. His great-grandfather flew with Pappy Boyington in the South Pacific. His grandfather flew dropping snake and napalm in Vietnam, and his father flew in Iraq and Afghanistan for guys like me. But he, as he's flying his state-of-the-art F-35, and we meet him, is lamenting the fact that he doesn't really feel, well, he doesn't feel quite like a real pilot. He feels more like a technician up there in the cockpit. And just as this happens, the controls are taken away from him. He loses an ability to fly his plane as it diverts into Iranian airspace. So as those two crises are emerging, the phone rings in the Situation Room in the White House with the National Security staff, and we meet one of those staffers, and that is Sandy Chowdhury, a 1st-generation American whose family comes from India. He is a graduate of the Fletcher School, where Jim and I are both alumni from, very proud. And on the other end of the line is the Chinese military attaché to the United States, Admiral Lin Bao. And he is someone who has an interesting background as well. He's of dual parentage, both American and Chinese, so he was raised in China. His mother was American, and this has really given him an advantage throughout his career, that he's someone who, although Chinese, deeply understands the American psyche. However, he's also, he feels, never been truly trusted by his own government. But he's there to deliver a message to the White House via Sandy Chowdhury, which is that these two events, the confrontation going on in the South China Sea and the downing of this American aircraft into Iran, are not unrelated. And sort of at the end of chapter 1, without disturbing too much, we see this cyber attack occur, and well, let's just say the lights go out and the Chinese effectively blink the entire East Coast. And I just add one more character, because the novel is driven by 5 primary characters, and that is Brigadier Qasim Farshad of the Iranian paramilitary Quds Force. And so when Wedge is downed into Iranian airspace, waiting for him on the tarmac is Brigadier Farshad. And as I mentioned, his name is Qasim Farshad because he is the namesake of his godfather, Qasim Soleimani. Farshad's father was killed subverting an assassination attempt against Soleimani when the two men were much younger. So at that point, this is really just sort of the first 30 or 40 pages of the novel. The table has been set. You're with those primary characters throughout the book, and we enter the world of 2034.
I'll just add one final thought. This is not a Tom Clancy techno thriller where the technology is the center of the story. It's just not that. And it is about characters. It's about human beings encountering a war, which at the end of the day is what all wars are about, the impact it has on human beings. So we're very happy and proud with the novel and looking forward to questions and comments.
I wanted to jump in and say, you gave a great overview of the first chapter, which left me thinking of a song, because I always think in musical terms, and the song that I was left thinking, if you guys remember Kenny Loggins' Highway to the Danger Zone.
Of course.
Okay. I think that was in Top Gun.
Yeah.
The entire time. And now I have to tell you, after reading the book, no spoilers, every time I see a piece of news, I'm thinking, oh my God, is that what's going to happen in the book? The big tanker that's blocking the Suez Canal. Was that predicted by this book? Or Biden's press conference today and talking about China and the decision of the world between autocracy and democracy. It was as if he was speaking your book. I think that sentence was even in the book. You have no idea how hard it was to get that inserted in the president's comments. We got it done. But I think, it's not just a cautionary tale. I do want to say it's also philosophy. It's philosophical. You have a lot of philosophy about what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be a military power. There's so much history in it, Thucydides, so many quotes, kind of reflective quotes on history, on philosophy. That's why I think it takes it out of Tom Clancy and into a world where people are making decisions based on this idea of what do we want our world to be? Where do we want our children to be? Many of these characters have children and they're thinking about their children. So they do feel drawn very much from real life. And so I'm giving you all these real world examples because the book really came to life for me. And I wanted to ask you, which characters are you? Which characters resonate with you? Admiral Elliot?
And I may surprise you, but the character that really I feel drawn to and closest to is not the American surface warfare officer, Sarah Hunt, although there's a fair amount of Sarah Hunt in me, but it's really Lin Bao. It's the Chinese admiral who, as I did, as the book opens, is pining away for the ocean, for the sea. He wants to get back to sea. He wants to be in command of a ship. It's what he's always wanted. It's what he's always done. And as someone who had 6 tours of duty in the Pentagon, I know what it feels like to be riding that desk in the 5-sided puzzle palace and wishing I was back at sea. And Secondly, Lin Bao, his greatest dream in his life is to finish up his military career and become a teacher, be an educator, be a professor. And of course, that's what I did as I concluded my long misspent youth in the Navy, went to be the dean at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. It's a great second act, I think, for military people to kind of turn around all you've learned, good and bad, and bring it to a classroom and bring it to another generation. So for me, there's a fair amount of me in Lin Bao.
Well, I would say that there is a fair amount of both of us in every single character in this book. When I look at them, I identify with a character like Hassan Farshad because he's a veteran of our forever wars, although he fought on the opposite side. So there are many things that he says that I very much identify with. Obviously, I served as a Marine Corps officer, so there's a lot of wedge, and I've known lots of wedges and maybe been a bit of a wedge myself at times. And then there's a character like Sandy Chowdhury, who, we were talking before. He likes to eat at City Lights Chinese food restaurant in Washington, D.C. That's my favorite Chinese restaurant in D.C. But he also talks about the history of the USS Maine. And as you'll see over the Admiral's left shoulder, there is a painting of the USS Maine. So there's lots of us in all of these characters. And what you said, Tatiana, really resonates with me, kind of some of these philosophical elements and that many of these characters have children, some don't, but, I myself, when I served in our wars, I was right until the very, very end. I had an infant daughter on my very last deployment, but I was a single guy. And I would say that I don't feel like I ever understood war until I had children myself, because I don't think you can actually understand loss, truly profound loss. And I mean, you can, but I think it takes it to a new level when you have children, and understanding how war can so much be fueled, yes, by politics, but also by people who've just suffered tremendous loss. And I think when you're writing a novel, particularly one that is character driven, you're really trying to get inside these people's heads and understand how they're experiencing these events. And I think, it's impossible to talk about war without talking about family too, and how it affects families.
Yeah. No, I liked, again, the characters are well developed. They're real people, right? And sometimes when we have these types of books, you have the stock characters that are two-dimensional. These are real people, and Tatiana and I, as graduates of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, can forgive the Tufts Fletcher predominance there, that our alma mater isn't as represented as it should be among the characters. But one of the things that really struck me in reading through it, which I think is so critical, and it ties into one of the perspectives certainly that we teach here at Newport, and that we teach that is taught elsewhere, the cognitive perspective for decision making, which is that you have to look at people as that they're, people aren't computers. They are human beings. They process the world. And one of the things that comes through the book, which I thought was important and is critical for readers to understand, is that different people are going to have different tolerance for risk. They're going to have a different tolerance for rolling the dice or for taking steps. And I think that one of the issues that Americans often have is our tendency to mirror image, that if we're not going to do something, so no one else is going to do it. Therefore, it won't happen. And that the characters, you see that the Chinese not just Lin Bao, but the other Chinese figures that and the conflicts within there among the Iranians, their risk calculus, what the Russians are doing, and trying to seek that kind of opportunism of how can they play this, but also within each of the countries, and then of course within the United States. I think it was very useful that yes, things even as petty as someone on the National Security Council being frozen out of a meeting, a call not being put through, someone being kept out of the loop, not for any grand strategic reason, but because of personal rivalries. I thought all of that was important to try to give a flavor to the novel. With that, something that I did want to ask, and I think Tatiana may also want to ask some of this too, as in terms of character development. Obviously, for your World of 2034, you decided to make some definitive assumptions, right? The novel can't flow if you don't have certain assumptions. And one of them is that you have decided that the two-party system in the U.S. has become so broken that the president is no longer a candidate, is an independent, right? That the two-party system is kind of, in the 2020s has kind of exhausted itself. Of course, you wrote this before, what's happened over the last number of months, but, is there a sense that you have that, we're going through some profound domestic changes that will make the world of the 2030s look a lot different than the political world that we are familiar with right up through to 2021?
I think it's entirely possible. I have two daughters in their late 20s, and they look at both political parties and just shake their heads. And I think that many Americans feel as though we're just stuck with this. We're stuck with Republicans and Democrats, as though in the Constitution somewhere, Article XX says there will always be two political parties. One shall be called Republicans, one shall be called Democrats. Newsflash, that's not in the Constitution. When we commissioned the United States of America, there were no Republicans, there were no Democrats. We started out with Whigs, nationalists, federalists. Eventually we got to Democrats, we got to Republicans. There is nothing to say that we cannot change again. 100 years ago, the surging political movement was Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party, the actual name of the Bull Moose Party. Ironically, now progressive has been co-opted by the left of the Democratic Party, but it was originally the center right wing of the Republican Party. So my point is, I think there is every opportunity for the possibility of a new political party or a change in the system that can elect an individual on their merits. The president in the novel is someone who is of neither party. Deliberately, we didn't make up a new party and have her be the flag bearer of that. I think it's entirely possible we'll have a different process. Will it be 10 to 15 years from now or 50 to 75 years from now? We don't know. But I'd say, as always in a book like this, you have to kind of imagine your way into the future. And I think this is an area that Elliot and I are going to explore more in the future in our writing as well.
I love. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I would just say, I would only add that it's, if you're writing a book that's about a war the United States is engaged in, in the near future, you have to project out that our politics are going to remain some version of what we see today. And so that type of domestic dysfunctionality obviously affects our ability to respond coherently to the crisis like we imagine in 2034.
And by the way, you were saying a moment ago about Georgetown versus Fletcher. I will point out that probably the darkest character in the book is a graduate of West Point.
West Point.
So, go Navy, beat Army.
Go beat Army.
In all seriousness, you made a really important point a minute ago that I don't want to gloss over, which is this is what I call the principle of big doors swing on small hinges. And that means that, as you said, a tiny meeting where someone isn't invited, but that person has the data point that might have changed the course of everything. That's real. As I mentioned earlier, 6 tours in the Pentagon, 1 at State Department, 1 at the NSC staff. I know the interagency pretty well. Elliot, White House fellow, has been in this world as well. It is remarkable how often the big door of decision swings on some small hinge, a person, a mid-level person, someone who arrived late at work and didn't get into the meeting or didn't have a chance to read their email queue before they went to the meeting. That changes history. And you see it again and again, and you see it in 2034.
Both of you, Admiral and Elliot, use the word imagine, imagination, imagining the future. And I know in previous interviews, I've been reading your other interviews, you said that you started out at a much later date, but then events brought you back and back and back. So what date did you start out with? Because I'm so curious, because you said that in another interview, and I'm so curious. Where did you start out? How did you come to 2034? And part two of that question is, you mentioned also that events overtook your drafts. You had to add in the pandemic, and you added in really nuanced ways. I thought really brilliant nuanced ways, and I won't give them away. But how much did you feel like you had to add in things that were happening that you didn't even expect to happen? So, part one, what year did you start out with, and how did you get to 2034? And then what did you feel you had to add in from 2020?
Yeah, I think we started with the dates sort of always in pencil in the early drafts, but it was out there. I mean, could be to late 2050s. We were just. I think when you're writing a book, the book kind of has to tell you its mood when it's taking place. But what very quickly became clear to us was, the date was almost like a tide coming up a beach, and it kept getting like closer and closer to our toes until we had sort of been talking about the date so much that we realized the date was going to be the title of the book. And that actually occurred pretty late in the process when we figured that out. But with regards to your comment on present events overtaking the narrative, I mean, that's certainly happened. Probably the most obvious one was the coronavirus. Another one I remember very specifically was over Christmas of 2019-20, that kind of winter period, was when Qasem Soleimani was killed. Yeah. And we had earlier drafts that had the character Farshad had a different backstory with Qasem Soleimani. So I remember, opening up my phone the next morning. I can't remember who called home, but we were both like, God, we're gonna have to rethink all this and how it features into the book. But I think that's also, the joy of writing a book is it forces you to kind of reimagine the narrative. And so much of this book has been, listen, if there is a year where we have gone back and said, like, I can't imagine. I don't think any of us have said as much as we said it this past year with the pandemic. And I think if you look at the pandemic as one of the great catastrophes that America has been through in the last 7,500 years, I think you could say 9/11 was another catastrophe that we endured, and Pearl Harbor attack, for instance. All three of those were things where the post-mortem was these were failures of imagination. And the spirit of this book is okay, let's go ahead and let's try to imagine what can happen next as a way of inoculating ourselves from it. Because I think at this point, you might be able to say that, imagination has become a national security imperative. We need to be projecting out what some of these catastrophes might be just to improve our readiness.
Yeah, let me add to that if you put a marker in your mind that 10 to 15 years from now, the trend lines are driving us toward a war with China, I think that is inarguable. Then it becomes possible to reverse engineer it back to the present and say, okay, what led us there? You don't wake up in 2034 and go to war with China. There are a series of discrete things that happen that we could debate about in foreign policy circles. Will Taiwan fall to China in a military invasion in the next 5 to 7 years? That was just testified to by the current 4-star admiral commander of the Indo-Pacific Command without any qualification. He simply said, I think this could happen in the next 6 years. This is Admiral Phil Davidson, who commands all U.S. forces in the Pacific, and newsflash, is reading the highest level intelligence that anybody has access to. His relief, who is testifying in front of Congress to get the job, said 2 days ago that a military move against Taiwan is much closer than people think, unquote. This is real, folks. And it doesn't mean that we have to just stumble along and accept all these bad outcomes, but it does mean we have to think consciously about the far end of the spectrum, reverse engineer our way back, and avoid it. That's the essence of 2034.
I mean, I think having the date in the title, it reminded me of some of Paul Erdman's books, Crash of the Panic of '79, The Crash of '89. It's good to have a date, which then gets people thinking. Also, I think because we are coming to an end of a certain series of cycles, right? And we've already discussed a bit, we may be coming to an end in a domestic political cycle. We're certainly coming to a new start in a technological cycle that is beginning, that will carry us forward. We're coming to an end of a particular post-Cold War cycle in international affairs, and a move towards much more truer multipolarity in the international system. So again, that thinking back and reimagining, reverse engineering, as you put it, is quite critical. One last point, and I think then we'll probably want to go, or then Tatiana, give her a last question as well, and then go to the audience. But in some of the things when I was reading 2034, I was thinking about a presentation that Michelle Flournoy gave at the Hoover Institute about a year and a half, 2 years ago. It was prior to the pandemic, so it must have been about 2 years ago. And some of these things that she was worried about looking forward. And one of them was the question that we don't yet have worked out, either among ourselves or with our competitors, rules of the game when it comes to the use of cyber. Where does cyber tip over into nuclear? Is there a type of cyber attack that would be so devastating that we might consider or be forced to consider using a nuclear weapons? In a sense here, as we move forward, and part of this reimagination, I mean, is there a need for the Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, to really convene strategic stability talks even with if there are autocracies and we don't see eye to eye, but at least saying, look, we don't want to stumble into a conflict where we're on very uncertain ground, and that the nuclear question could then come back, because I mean, certainly for the last 30 years we've all lived with that sigh of relief that the Cold War sword of Damocles is no longer hanging over our head. But now it appears that we're stumbling back into something that, and you talked about children. I never expected a day that my son would be living in a world where he might have to worry about the type of nuclear war or nuclear exchange that everyone between 1945 and 1989 lived with as a certainty. So any thoughts there about the reverse engineering? Is there a proactive measure of really sitting down with China, with Russia, with other emerging and emergent powers to say we really need to set some rules of the road so we don't sleepwalk into a conflict?
So when I kind of conceived this idea of the novel, I wasn't looking forward. I was looking back. I was looking back to World War I, where these nations that were economically integrated were united by ties of blood in the royal families. Kaiser of Germany was the nephew of Queen Victoria, yet those nations sleepwalked into a war. And I was also looking at the Cold War, at Dr. Strangelove, at Failsafe, at the Bedford incident, at the Third World War, Sir John Hackett. All of that literature helped us during the Cold War to imagine how terrible a war would be. And I think it motivated us to avoid it. And it helped us, your point, Nick, create regimes of deterrence that avoided the use of nuclear weapons. So the short answer to your question is yes. It is past time that we brought certainly U.S., China, and Russia around the table. And frankly, because this is an asymmetric weapon that is open in many ways to Iran and North Korea and other, if you will, rogue nations, we need to start creating a regime of deterrence, much as we have in the case of nuclear weapons, around cyber. And I think tri-party talks between the U.S., China, and Russia are in order. Unfortunately, we are in a period of extreme acrimony between the United States, China, and Russia at this very moment. We have the president of the United States declaiming, I think accurately and correctly, that Vladimir Putin is a killer. We have our Secretary of State, my good friend Tony Blinken, meeting with his counterpart in Anchorage, Alaska, throwing verbal hand grenades at each other for an hour in front of the press. this probably isn't the most propitious time to bring these parties together, but it is long past time that we do it for the sake of our children, for the sake of trying to avoid this war, for the sake of not sleepwalking, and for the sake of creating deterrence in the world of cyber.
I see a very full queue of questions, but I want to ask one before we go to the queue, and I'm going to try not to repeat what I've been reading. Where does the media and popular opinion rest in your book? You know, I see BBC mentioned, a couple other channels, but you know, is it really just these players? I mean, do we, and I say we, I'm a journalist, do we have any role to play?
Well, I think if you look at the book, there is actually one significant point in this escalation, which is, and without giving too much away, we mentioned how this one Marine pilot is taken down into Iran, and during the course of his captivity, he sort of becomes a cause celeb with hashtag Free Wedge trending across all social media platforms. And there is a almost sort of Falklands-esque desire in the United States to not be shamed with one of our pilots kind of trotted out before the media of our adversaries. And so that begins to force the president into a more hawkish posture than she might otherwise have taken on her own. And there's also factions within the White House that want to see her take on a more hawkish posture. And some of this does start to play out in the media. So there's certainly a media component in the novel. I'd say it's probably not the driving narrative of the novel, but you definitely do see it in places.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as Elliot referenced, over my shoulder is USS Maine, which blew up famously in 1898, and the United States launched into what was literally a global war with Spain in 1898, in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean Sea, in the Pacific. And it occurred because this beautiful ship blew up suddenly, mysteriously in Havana Harbor. It was attributed to Spanish terrorists. Later, that was debunked, but it wasn't debunked until 50 years later. And the United States had a rallying cry driven by Hearst journalism, so-called yellow journalism of the day. And the rallying cry was, "Remember the Maine." You can drop a plumb line from that event to Free Wedge in 2034. Media matters, it matters deeply, and it is often part of the spark that creates a war.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we'll turn over to Alex Woodson to, again, we have so many questions. I think we'll try to get as many as we can, and certainly invite our panelists to, if you can, or have the chat open, you can at least see what the commentary has been. But Alex, you're the keeper of the queue, so we'll let you take it from there.
Sure, thanks, Nick. Yeah, we have so many questions, really great questions. Hopefully we can get to all of them. So I'm just going to ask two together here, not really related, but trying to get through all of them. So I'll ask two at first. Two people ask, Harris Romich and Laszlo Shaks, apologies if I mispronounced that. They both want to know what the role of Europe is in this version of 2034, what the role of Europe is in the war. And then John Jung asks, since 2034 is 50 years since 1984, did you think of Orwell during your writing? Any connections to any of the characters in his book?
I'll start with the Orwell half of the question, maybe take on some of the Europe, and then allow the Admiral to take the last half of that. But with regards to Orwell, I mean, listen, I think, he obviously, his novel 1984, many of his other works are obviously, huge works in the realm of what one might call dystopian fiction. But I think there's also other films like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I think, for us, we had spent so long in the writing process trying to orient ourselves into, when exactly is this happening, that's kind of how we landed, as I said before, on it being the title of the book, in so much as we thought it would be smart to really anchor a reader from the get-go, as they know exactly when this is all going on. And I think there's some, nice artistic echoes there. With regards to the role of Europe in the book, Europe doesn't feature too prominently in the book, But a lot of that too is also comes down to just to narrative and the type of book that we were trying to write. I mean, we really were aligned from the outset of whether we were not trying to write a Herman Wouk-esque Winds of War 900-page doorstopper with appendices of characters that you had to continually cross-reference. We wanted this to be a quick read, an accessible read, and even a fun read given a grim subject matter. So that being said, with 5 primary characters, there's sort of only so much of the world you're going to be touching on directly through their experience. But I'll hand it over to you, Jim, for anything else on that.
Excellent points, all. The only thing I'll add is, as Elliot said, you have to narrow the focus and have principal characters on the stage. And we wanted really deeply to include India, because I think personally, when 300 years from now, the history of the 21st century is written, it'll be less about the rise of China and more about the rise of India because of demographics, because it's a democracy. It's already linked to the West by a colonial past and a lingua franca, English. I think India will play a very significant role in this century. We really wanted to include India. By the time you're done with U.S., China, India, Russia, Iran, you've kind of filled the stage with characters. If we do another novel later on, maybe there'll be a European, maybe Japan will have a significant role. Wait and see. But we picked these. I think they're the right ones for 2034 in terms of where the world will be focused.
I'll ask 3 questions now, all connected to technology. Charles Rosenberg asks, does warfare in space play a role? Echo English asks, in regards to the cyber warfare piece of the book, do we have the cyber capability to shut off China? And Carlo Zappieri asks, can you talk more about the role of technology? One of your main characters mentions a cult of technology as a weakness for the US military. Is she speaking for the authors here?
Do you want to take the third one, Elliot? I'll grab the first 2.
Sure. With regards to the cult of technology being mentioned by one character, I think it's something that we were certainly thinking about in the book, which is, how can the most advanced technology ultimately become a hindrance? If I could share an anecdote, I also work as a journalist and covered the Syrian civil war for a number of years. And I was down on the border once and had the opportunity to sit down with another Iraq war veteran, except he was a former member of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So we'd fought on opposite sides. And so the 2 of us sat down, kind of 2 old veterans talking about our war, sharing a cup of tea. And at a certain point in our conversation, he quoted Albert Einstein to me. And he said, Einstein predicted everything that's going on right now, meaning across the border in Syria. And he said, Einstein said that the 3rd World War would be a nuclear war, but the 4th World War would be fought with sticks and stones. And that's how we defeated you in Iraq and Afghanistan, with sticks and stones. And so this idea that an over-reliance on technology and perhaps a complacency in believing too heavily that your superior technology will carry the day can become a hindrance. And it's a theme that we definitely wanted to get at in the book. And one character mentions it, but I would just say, lots of characters say many things in the book. And I try to read the types of books I enjoy. I try to write the types of books I enjoy reading, and I don't like reading didactic books. So you're going to hear from a whole lot of people, a whole lot of opinions, and it's not me or Admiral Stavridis trying to tell you what to think.
I'll add that on the character point, I'd invite everybody listening tonight to think about what's my favorite book. And I guarantee you will not be able to remember the details of the plot or precisely when the book was even said or what characters had to eat. You won't remember all that. You will remember the characters. You'll remember their personalities, their persona. For me, I love Hemingway's novel, The Old Man and the Sea, probably because I'm an old man and I've spent a lot of time at sea. And I have always loved Santiago the fisherman because he is old. He is destroyed, but he's never truly defeated. He cares about the next generation coming along. He's resilient. There's a lot to love about Santiago. And I think for all the characters in the book, there's something compelling about each one of them in my view. And when I was preparing for this book tour, you know, we'd written the book like over a year ago. It's a long production timeline. And I thought, well, I better read the book again just to make sure I've got everything in my head. And by the end of the book, you know, this old grizzled admiral was in tears about outcomes, some good, some bad, you know, and that's the reality of a book that you really love. It's the characters. Now, to the first two questions about technology, space is kind of off stage, but is critical. I think the creation of a space force by the Trump administration was the correct move. I would argue that by 2034, there will be not only a space force, but a cyber force. And I think that's the right move for the nation because space and cyber, as some would say, the fourth and fifth domains after land, sea, air, are increasingly vital and important. That's why we need professionals in the military who are utterly devoted to those domains. If you go back to the end of World War II, you know, we had an Army, a Navy, and a Marine Corps. We didn't have an Air Force. Why? Because the services kept pushing back, didn't want it, said, we'll take care of the aviation side. Today, we can't imagine conducting military operations without an Air Force. We're at that point, I believe now, with both space and cyber. They need to be separate services so we get a cadre of warriors who really focus on them. And cyber, broadly speaking, hey, go read Ender's Game, a great novel about young people in cyber who saved their world because they're, if you will, digital natives. They're not bound by the past. And I think we are going to face significant challenges in cyber because of the massive threat surface that's been created by the Internet of Things, probably 40 billion devices, each one of which is a separate pathway to everything else in the Internet. This is a big challenge. We haven't solved it. And it gets back to what Nick and I were talking about earlier. We're not going to be able to defend it. And therefore, we need deterrent regimes so that if China decides to blink our electric grid, we have a series of responses. They know those will come, and therefore they will be less likely to pull that cyber weapon out of the toolkit any more than they would pull the nuclear weapon out of the toolkit. Although in 2034, both appear.
Okay, so I think we have time for 4 more questions, so I'll do 2 and 2, and we'll see where we are after that. Lots of great questions, really, really good stuff. So Derek Westman asks, at one point in the novel, after the first salvos have been exchanged, the narrator suggests that the U.S. president's greatest weakness was her fear of appearing weak. With that in mind, Track 2 diplomacy plays a prominent role in the book, especially with India and the ultimate de-escalation. Do you feel that Track 2 diplomacy and the hyper-connected environment still provides a face-saving avenue to resolve disputes between great powers or otherwise? And then Shelley Garrett asks, does the aging demographics of China figure in 2034?
I'll take the first one. Certainly, without question, Track 2 diplomacy matters. Diplomacy has a personal component to it. And in the novel, you're correct, whoever asked the question, that yes, there is a significant level of that behind the scenes interlocutor engagement. And I think it will continue. And there's a powerful kind of backstory in terms of one of the characters and his ethnicity, his national background, and how that becomes a significant factor. Again, back to big doors swing on very small hinges. What if that had not existed, that channel? Could events have turned out worse because of a different engagement by India? I think very possibly. So I turn the other question over to Elliot. Demographics in China?
Sure. I think we'll say the demographics in China, we already alluded to that. You know, one of the reasons India is a key player in this book is because of its demographics, and the one-child policy in China has been, you know, a disaster. And so, you see a China that's still formidable, but there are also many other emerging powers. To the front part of that question, I would only add, the comment about the American president's greatest weakness is the fear of being perceived weak. I think we've seen that in our history. I mean, if you go back, for instance, to the end of the Eisenhower years in the Kennedy administration, Kennedy's fear of being perceived as weak led to strategic miscalculations in places like Vietnam, for instance. So some of those kind of larger broad brush themes are certainly throughout the pages of 2034.
Okay, and two more questions from Jonathan Gage. Please reveal some of the specific reverse engineering steps you imagine in our China relations aside from multilateral talks, specifically regarding Taiwan and the evolving and perhaps deteriorating circumstances in Myanmar and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And then from Mike McCracken, does the United Nations and international law and treaties play a role, or are they overwhelmed by the powerful, just not paying much attention to the smaller nations?
I'll grab the front end of the question. I think that inevitably United Nations, international organizations are going to play some role going forward. But in the world of 2034, we see a world where they have faded out. Again, that's part of the first question. What are the steps of reverse engineering? I'll give you 5 real quick. For the United States, from our perspective. Number one, we need to learn more and understand more about China. The Chinese understand us better than we understand China. And without unpackaging that fully, that simply means we need to become more empathetic and understanding, not agreeing with them, but understanding it. Number 2, allies, partners, and friends. Creating a network. Let's try to get this out of a channel of U.S. versus China, which is where we end up in 2034. And let's end up with allies, partners, and friends. It is no coincidence, comrade, as we would have said in the Cold War, that the United States of 2034 is essentially bereft of allies, partners, and friends. To me, that's perhaps the darkest end of the spectrum. Number 3, technology. We've talked about it here, as in we have got to up our game in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, cyber, space, all the things we've talked about. They're going to be critical in this competition with China, including artificial intelligence, machine learning. 4th, unification here in the country. The divisions in our nation are particularly pernicious in my view. If we can't correct those going forward, we are going to be in very dire straits facing China. And 5th, and finally, I think that it's what we've talked about all night. We've got to imagine distinct outcomes so that we can create the kind of steps that I just spoke about.
So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'll just ask 2 quickly. This is from Catherine Penny. Is there any referencing to the impact of the global disbursement of funds from China? And then from Matthew Deffenbaugh, at one point, the Chinese defense minister discusses the predictability of the Americans. How much of a vulnerability do you believe all of our strategic predictability is? How do you balance that vulnerability with the necessity to assure allies?
Well, I'll start with the comment about American predictability. I think throughout the novel, obviously, if we're going to create a book that has believable Chinese characters, you're going to hear them speak to one another and also read their interior thoughts about how they view the United States, and their critiques of the United States are not always charitable. And I actually think that's one of the great funs and one of the things that was the most fun and most enjoyable in writing this novel was to really stand in the other's shoes and say, how do they view us? And in many respects, they view us as predictably moralistic, view us in that we live and work in a democratic system that is incredibly inefficient and in times indulgent. And I think we saw this past week up in Alaska, from the mouths of the Chinese, how they view us and view what they believe to be certain hypocritical strands in American society. And so, those are in the pages of this book, because it would not be a realistic story if those views weren't given a full airing.
Yeah, in terms of disbursement of funds, I'm not quite sure I followed the question, but I'll expand it slightly and say, if the question is, how are the U.S. and China economically intertwined, and will that help us prevent war? The short answer is, I hope so. And we are very economically intertwined. We trade more in a day than the U.S. and the Soviet Union traded in a year. We are deeply intertwined with China. And I think that'll help, although I keep going back. What rattles in my brain is Barbara Tuchman's marvelous book, The Guns of August, about how intertwined all those European nations were right before they went into the big dance and killed, 20 million of the finest young Europeans in the First World War. So economically, yes, we're intertwined. China owns a lot of U.S. debt. That's a capability they have. If they started selling that, it would impact our economy. On the other hand, we are their biggest market. If we simply shut it, as Donald Trump alluded to doing at one time, that would be a kind of a nuclear option economically. Could those kinds of things happen? Possibly. But I think more likely, at least in the immediate term, we're going to continue to be economically intertwined. We'll have a lot of geopolitical friction around that core of integration. The question is, does the geopolitical friction get into that economic core? Does an invasion of Taiwan would do it? Sinking 3 American destroyers in the South China Sea to consolidate your claim to ownership of the South China Sea, that would do it. A massive cyber attack, that would do it. But absent something that drives into that economic integration, we can be hopeful that will at least be part of the reverse engineering we spoke about a moment ago. Folks, I'm going to have to leave it there. That was a terrific session with lots and lots of good questions. I want to thank Tatiana and Nick for having us on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, I encourage everyone, if you haven't read the book yet, to get it. And I fully expect that we'll be seeing the limited Netflix or Amazon series that will be developed, hopefully coming to screens in 2022 or 2023, to take the characters which have leapt from the page and then to be brought to the screen. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. And please, even after we've concluded our session, continue to post, and whether the Carnegie Council or Doorstep Twitter accounts, further comments and the like. And we hope to continue this conversation and have you back, especially if and when your book becomes translated to the screen, and then to see how Hollywood takes your characters and who gets cast.
Danny DeVito is going to play me. Thanks a lot. I'll see
Thank you.